and social movements. Well, we're all supposed to think, well, social movements are great. And the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, gay liberation, all the incredible rights movements of the last 50 or 60 years. But that's in part because we look back at the ones that were successful and that were really deeply right about righting injustices. And now when I look at social activism on campus and among young people, I think I have a much greater appreciation for how hard it is to change institutions, especially complicated institutions that are generally trying to be open and humane anyway. And I look at the policies that many young people are pressing universities to adopt or pressing companies to adopt. And what I see happening is unmoored moralism, trying to change institutions without understanding them. And I'm beginning to think that social activism may on net be a negative thing to the extent that now it is governed more by the social dynamics of social media and self-presentation than by any real study of a problem and attempt to come up with something that would work. So,
that's blindness, isn't it? I mean,
blindness. What do you mean? They're blind to what they're blind about?
Yes, exactly. It's ignorance of it. Yeah. Well, if you put someone on the spot and you ask them if they could run a nuclear power plant, they'll say no. But if you ask them what should be done about the entire world's electrical grid, they'll tell you the answer. Mm-hmm. And that's a good example of not decomposing the problem down into units that could actually be addressed intelligently. But so you're noticing this activism and you're doubtful about its utility, and your solution, and we can talk about this more, is to take the moral fervor out of it. So I was thinking recently about Jean Piaget's argument. His final stage of cognitive development, hardly anybody knows this, but it was the messianic stage.
Well, I've never heard about this.
Absolutely. There's many things about Piaget that people haven't heard about. That
messianic.
His goal was to unite religion and science.
Oh.
Yes. I mean, Piaget is a very strange character, and all you hear about is the rational stage theory. But anyways, the last stage was the messianic. And he identified that as a stage in late adolescence. Not everyone reached it, but that it involved a world-changing fervor. And he identified that as part of what catalyzed identity. And so we're seeing that these students, they come to university, they want to catalyze their identity in a profound way and orient themselves. And what seems to happen is the activist types tap into that and offer them a solution. And the solution seems dangerous, but it doesn't look like the intelligent people are offering anything that's useful as an alternative, because they're not getting anywhere with it. And so we have to ask ourselves exactly why that is. And part of it is the lack of romance, I think. When Orwell wrote about the Nazis in the 1930s, he was very careful to highlight their dramatic use of ritual and the romantic attraction. Now, of course, he was absolutely opposed to everything they were doing, as anyone rightly should be. But Orwell was very wise and about human nature in general. And there's a drama in what's being offered to adolescents that the rational approach doesn't seem to engender. And I don't know how to solve that problem. I think it's a terrible problem. But
I'm going to mediate between Jordan, what you've been saying, and what John offered, and I do tend to agree with John. I was trying to make some concessions toward the possibility that you could best energize people by somehow co-opting this fervor. But I think it's probably an open question: how much can you engage people without the trappings of religion or pseudo-religion? Can you engender a problem-solving mindset as opposed to a struggle mindset?
That's right.
And before we write people off and saying, no, they can't, no one likes solving problems, it's too boring, it doesn't get the heart pounding, they've got to wear colored shirts, they've got to salute something, they've got to bow down. We have, we did eliminate smallpox. We've drastically reduced the amount of warfare, partly because of John and Yoko and Peter, Paul and Mary, but also because of much more practical treaties and organizations. We've drastically reduced extreme poverty, not because of the teachings of the Hebrew prophets or Jesus, but because of China and Indonesia and India adopting capitalism to tie into the theme of John's impending book. So there is a tendency, there's a vulnerability in people to want to belong to transcendent movements involving some kind of conflict. On the other hand, we haven't done so bad at combating disease and poverty and war with a more technocratic problem-solving mindset. So maybe Jonathan's right that we ought to just minimize these dangerous passions and treat more things as problems to be solved.
Well, my concern, I agree with your description of what came before, but my concern is that the universe is different after 2012 than it was before 2009, that the fundamental nature of society was rewired by everyone going on to social media, especially Facebook and Twitter, but all the other platforms as well. And so whatever was possible, whatever the arrangements were before, some of that is still valid today, but a lot of it isn't. And we often don't know what parts. And so whether you're talking about how we mobilize to solve problems, so just to take one example, activist movements generally had adults in them. They had adults, and then young people would come into them as well. And there were multiple generations of knowledge about how things work and how they want to change. But now that everyone is connected to everyone, and things go at many times the speed, I think you can have a groundswell for a reform of a system that gets pushed through within days or weeks, just by people with very little input from adults. And that's why I think we see over and over again demands, just speaking from the area I know best on campus, demands at dozens and hundreds of schools year after year for things that make race relations and inclusion and diversity worse. So I'm just concerned, and this is just one little example, but in so many ways, I think the 2010s were weird because life after 2012 is just fundamentally different from life before 2009.
Well, do you think? Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, although I see that happening, and there has been a change toward intolerance and struggle as opposed to problem solving in the last few years. On the other hand, the demands are being accepted by baby boomers, by the deans and the provosts. And if you rewind the tape back to when we were college students, there was an awful lot of inanity and extremism and repression of speech. E.O. Wilson and Dick Herrnstein and Tom Bouchard and many others were canceled. There were posters. I have one from 1984, a talk for E.O. Wilson, Bring Noisemakers. And now the student activists of when we were students are now the deans and the provosts who are happily ratifying these extreme demands. At the same time, and we all know this from our students, this is not a uniformly woke generation. There are an awful lot of students who are intimidated into silence, and they think, gee, I must be the only sane person. Everyone else is crazy. And an awful lot of people are all thinking that. So I do agree that there is a problem of just mature judgment, but it isn't completely a cohort effect. And a lot of inanity in our generation.
But that's my point, is that it's not a cohort effect. It's a change in dynamics. So it used to be that there would be some activists, but other people could still have a conversation, or they could still play a role. You're right that the people giving into the demands are people from the previous generation who were at least that generation earlier, but they're not happily giving in. I've spoken to many leaders in the academic world. They all hate it. They feel stuck. They feel pressured. They don't know what to do. And now it's the same thing, people leading nonprofits, especially progressive nonprofits or companies. So it's not that young people are woke, it's that the dynamics have changed so that the woke among the young now have such power to intimidate others into silence. And this is what we see in universities, that students are not afraid of their professors, they're afraid of a subset of students. And the professors are not afraid of anyone except this subset of students. And the presidents, well, they have donors and other people to please, but the dynamics of social media allows a small group to weaponize their moralism and to intimidate others into silence. And this is happening in so many institutions, not everywhere, but it is happening. And so what we need to do is not change a generation. What we need to do is change the dynamics so that bad ideas don't dominate and intimidate.
So why do you single out 2012?
So 2009 is when Facebook added the like button and Twitter added the retweet button. And before then, social media was not particularly polarizing. People would put up a Friendster page or a MySpace page or a Facebook page with what they liked, and here's who I am, not polarizing at all. And then in 2009, you get the like button and then the retweet button, and then Twitter and Facebook copy each other very quickly. So now both platforms have both like and retweet. Now both platforms have huge amounts of information about engagement, and now they can algorithmicize all the feeds. And so as it's more engaging, this is the 2 or 3 years where, at least adolescents, I have data data from national surveys showing this is the 2 years when adolescents go from mostly not being on these platforms every day to now teen social life is mostly conducted on various platforms.
So do you think are you characterizing that as a positive feedback loop, essentially? The like buttons with the algorithms?
Yes, exactly. It's a feedback loop, and it's also the most powerful, not Pavlovian, it's just behaviorist conditioning mechanism ever. Thank you. Thanks, Steve. Operant, yes. I haven't taught Psych 101 in 10 years. But, if you think about it, many people have seen that video of B.F. Skinner training a pigeon to turn in a circle by just reinforcing slightly more counterclockwise behaviors in the video. And if you think about it, as soon as someone gets on social media and they post something, now people are giving them little reinforcements. And it's within seconds. I mean, you post something and then sometimes you check within a minute, what did people think about it? And so we have, so this is why, these are ideas that I developed with Tobias Rose Stockwell. We had an article in The Atlantic on why why democracy is going haywire or something like that.
Well, the positive feedback loop idea is really interesting too, because a lot of psychopathologies are positive feedback loops. So if you get depressed and you start isolating yourself because you're depressed, you get more depressed. If you drink alcohol and go into withdrawal and then drink to cure that, you become alcoholic. If you are agoraphobic and you avoid, you get more afraid. Like a lot of psychopathological processes are positive feedback loops.